Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good? Yay! We're excited to be here. Well, welcome all to the 17th Annual Queer Graduate Student Conference at UCLA. My name is Candy Rivera. And
my name is Rachel Greenberg.
And as the co-organizers of this year's Graduate Student Conference, we'd like to warmly welcome you to what we hope will become a memorable experience in your queer academic careers. So thank you so much for being here.
The 2015 conference theme, Curing the Queer from Pathology to Resistance, opens up a critical discussion on the reemergence of restorative therapies and other queer-phobic practices. In April 2015, President Barack Obama called for the end to conversion therapies of LGBTQ youth. Although California, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. are the only states or districts that have banned conversion therapies, these treatments are nonetheless practiced across the United States. We invited graduate students from across the nation and the globe to present research at this year's conference that both question and challenge the discourses and practices that continue to pathologize queer peoples and lead to hate crimes against the LGBT community across our nation.
So strange transition. So we would like to extend our deepest appreciation to every single one of you here today for making qgrad 2015 a tremendous success. Thank you all to the presenters for bringing such cutting-edge, crucial, and timely research to the table. And we also like to thank our co-sponsors for this event for their most generous support for the Queer Graduate Student Scholarship. So we'd like to extend our deepest appreciation to the David Bonet Foundation, the Dean of Humanities, David Shaver, the Dean of Social Sciences, Alessandro Duranti, the Chair of the Cesar E. Chavez Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies, Abel Valenzuela, to the Interim Director of the Chicano Studies Research Center, Charlene Villaseñor Black, and finally to the Gender Studies Department at UCLA.
And I would like to extend a hello and congratulations from our LGBT Studies Chair, Professor Gaspar de Alba, who's currently in Mexico City, and sends her regards and is very sad she could not be here today. And now we would like to introduce our Master of Ceremonies for the conference, Professor of Theater and Performance and affiliated faculty to the LGBT Studies program at UCLA, Mr. Sean Metzger.
Thanks. This will be brief. So I want to thank all of you lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, polyamorous, celibate, straight, questioning, queer, transgender, intersex, and gender nonconforming folks for being here today. I didn't want to assume, so I tried to cover everything. What I thought I was asked to do this because Alicia, as kind of old butch, needs a old femme to match her, so that didn't happen. But I thought if I can do nothing else, at least I could say thank you very much to our organizers, Candy Rivera, Rachel Greenberg, Kevin Medina, and Tamarian Brown, who have worked very, very, very hard to make this event possible today. Thanks a lot. You really did a lot of work. And I have been tasked with telling you the most important things of the day. So first, let me talk about toilets. There are gender-inclusive bathrooms on this floor. If you opt for a men's or a women's bathroom, please go to the second floor. And should you wander around campus, we want you to make sure you can relieve yourself without feeling oppressed. So the map in your folder, this beautiful folder you have, has all of the gender-inclusive bathrooms across UCLA marked for you. If you find yourself struggling for words today, know that we are also here to help. There's also a lexicon of useful terms in your packet. That's the orange pack. Food. See, this is all very important. So there are 3 raffle tickets. One of them is you're supposed to use them in the order that they are stapled. So one is for breakfast, one is for lunch, one is for dinner. Should you lose your ticket, you can see the registration desk and they'll give you another one. Swag. In addition to these very beautiful yellow folders that I have mentioned many times, we have little pill bottles to go with the conference theme. Don't be too excited, they're not drugs. It's just a little bit of sweet love for you. We also have really groovy t-shirts for all conference participants. But to get one, you will find an evaluation in the back of your conference packet, and if you will fill that out for us, we will gladly give you a t-shirt. We might if you don't, but you know. Okay, and make sure you pick up a cool pin as well. This evening, don't forget to see the launch of Queer Cats, UCLA's new online graduate student journal. This should be a really exciting event, marking the publication of graduate student work by your peers. I don't think there's anything quite like this in the country, so I really hope that this launch becomes a really major journal and venue for all of you to publish. There's not a lot of journals that do really interdisciplinary work, and I think the co-organizers here have really thought they really want to do something that reaches out to all of you from all different kinds of disciplines and have conversations and help people get their foot in the door in terms of publication. So I'm very excited about it, and I think you will be too. It looks great so far, and I hope to see all of your published work in there soon. A couple more public service announcements. If you have not noticed, there will be, or there are, photographers and videographers wandering around throughout the day. If you do not want your picture or image taken, you will have to run away from the camera, or you might be able to convince the person with the camera to not shoot you. But please let us know. If you lose your program or forget where you wanted to be sometime during the day, we have QR code that you can scan because we're very technologically savvy. So that has the conference program on it. And the back of your program, it also has the website for the conference. And we would like you to post stuff on Instagram, pictures of everything you like, anyone you think is like inspiring or hot or whatever. Just post it on Instagram and let people know that this is a great event. It's a hashtag qgrad-conference. That's the first time I said hashtag in my life, by the way. Thank you very much. Okay, so I suppose many people would think that I came up here to set the intellectual agenda or provide you with some guiding questions. But I want to emphasize, this is your conference. You may note that some of the moderators are former conference participants. I actually did this in the dark ages when it was first starting to go, and now I'm here. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Lisa Sloan, who's right there, who started as one of our graduate students, who presented here and is now has her doctorate, is teaching for us, and is here as a moderator. That can be you someday as well. I believe that all of you are the queer future that moves us from pathology to resistance. That future is yours, and I'm humbled to be a witness to its incipient formation today. On behalf of the LGBT Studies program, welcome to UCLA. Have a great conference.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to panel 1A. This is Homophobia in Global Public Discourse and LGBTQ Political Activism. My name is Lisa Sloan, and it is my pleasure to moderate this panel. Let's see, to my left, to your right, we have Milka Stefanos, who is joining us from Kennesaw University. We have Eric Baldwin, who is joining us from UC Irvine. And we have Lilith, who is joining us from the rhetoric program at UC Berkeley. And they all have wonderful papers that they're going to present to you, and I hope that we'll have a very rich dialogue together. We're going to go in the order that you're listed in the program. Is that okay with you? So that means Stefanos, you're first. Is that okay? Okay, all right. So take it away, Stefanos.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Stefanos Milkidis. I am a graduate student in American Studies program at Kennesaw State University in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm also a part-time assistant professor in the school in the Department of Visual Arts at Kennesaw State. And today I will be presenting a paper a shorter version of a paper called Two Weddings, a Lawsuit, and a Funeral, Contextualizing Transnational Homophobic Culture. During the summer of 2008, Greek society was shocked by a sequence of coincidental but highly influential events through which homosexuality became the epicenter of public discourse. On June 4th, popular actor and icon Nikos Sergianopoulos was found brutally murdered at his apartment in downtown Athens, killed by one of the many male hustlers that had had sexual relationships with the actor. A day earlier, the mayor of a remote Greek island performed the country's first same-sex marriages, wedding 2 men and 2 women. The Justice Ministry of Greece immediately declared the marriages illegal, and all involved faced charges. Within this climate, the Supreme Court convened on June 10 to examine the case between 3 residents of the island of Lesbos and the homosexual and lesbian community of Greece known as Olke. The islanders took the gay rights group to court, seeking to bar the group from using the word lesbian in its name. The plaintiffs alleged the term should be restored based on its geographic and cultural context, arguing that its reference to female homosexuality insults their identity. This study attempts to understand the role of public discourse in inciting and perpetuating homophobia as a phenomenon that transcends borders. Based on these events that happened in Greece 7 years ago, and considering that not many things have changed in that country since then, I will examine the above events by placing them in a comparative context with the United States. The study primarily examines the discourses that emerged from these events and assesses current laws, the role of the church, and mainstream media as universal factors in shaping public perceptions of homosexuality as negative and immoral. In gesturing towards an answer to the central question driving this study, the role of public discourse in mainstreaming homophobic attitudes and perpetuating discrimination against sexual minorities, I would like to present the events of 2008 that meant to shake the moral order of Greek society. Nikos Sergianopoulos was an idealized actor, a symbol of masculinity and romantic desirability. Both his life and career had been the subject of public scrutiny and critical appraisal. His public image was multi-tiered, including his own statements of a simulative heterosexuality, details of his personal life as revealed by the gutter press, as well as innuendos of his sexuality based on the suspicion of a double life. Parallel to the projected image of masculinity and suspected deviation, posthumous images that flooded the media of his alleged male lover and killer had a direct effect on the evolution of consciousness about hate crimes in Greece in relation to homosexuality. Sergianopoulos has indeed given a face to the homophobic hate crime, though face in this context appears like a synecdoche for the thousands of faces who had suffered from hate rhetoric, violence, medical restorative therapies, or murder before and after his brutal assassination. The enormous media attention that came with Sergianopoulos' death is partially attributed to his status as a heterosexual celebrity. It is also his mode of celebrity that has been popularized by the media after his death, exacerbating a morbid fascination with homosexuality, equalizing it with abuse, harassment, misery, and violence. This raises the question, how is it that homophobic hate crimes have such a powerful effect on people who had no direct personal experience with such a crime? Situating hate crime in a transnational context, it may help us see how the social meanings of well-known hate crimes contribute to the construction of a social problem through the process of identifying with the victim. The case of Matthew Shepard, a 21-year-old University of Wyoming student who died after being tortured, beaten, and tied to a fence for being gay, created a type of supportive alliance between the LGBT community and society at large. The severity of such crimes and their continuousness in public memory acquires a special meaning in Western democracies. Both cases of Sorianopoulos and Shepard generated an empathetic and supportive stance that was based on gay martyrdom, creating the circumstances of political expediency in combating hate crime as a response or a solution that hasn't yet failed. Sorianopoulos and Shepard's suffering blend into one another and come to stand in for all homophobic hate crime victims everywhere. In response to horrible acts of violence, we need martyrs. We need to mourn and memorialize those who have been lost as ways that can inspire further action. Scholar Elizabeth Castelli argues that martyrs are produced by the stories told about them. She suggests that martyrdom is conferred through repetition and commemoration. Thus, one becomes a martyr when a larger collective declares them as such. She writes, quote, the martyr story thereby becomes an authoritative ground for political argument, and because of the excess and absoluteness of the story itself, it makes powerful and irresistible claim upon its hearers, edging out competing stories and alternative arguments. End of quote. The legitimation of martyrdom is achieved through its utility as a means that prevents violence to reoccur, often accomplishing the passage of anti-hate crime legislation by retaining and reiterating the image of the martyr in the public's consciousness. Similarly, queerphobic medical restorative therapies were discounted as vestiges of hate-motivated practices. The antiquated view that homosexuality can be treated and any attempt to change or control sexual orientation is now largely considered as another form of hate crime, since it too stigmatizes homosexuality as a deviant collective behavior by victimizing the individual. Perhaps the value of hate crime legislation is that it has made it much more difficult for state and private authorities to adopt such practices as legitimate methods through which homosexuality would continue to be regarded as a treatable mental disorder. Historically, conversion methods spanned a wide range of medical interventions. According to Douglas Hattelman, these included the application of electric shock to the hands or genitals, or nausea-inducing drugs, which would be administered simultaneously with the presentation of homoerotic stimuli. Although in restorative therapies we have no martyrs to help us fight directly these so-called treatments, the processes through which they intend to interfere with sexual orientation was devalued by mainstream psychology and mental health organizations. Same-sex marriage, on the other hand, has dominated the discourse of LGBT rights almost in every Occidental country for the past decade. This attention continues to contribute to the development of further legal protection against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, which impacts the legitimacy of conversion therapies. Thus, the important legal advance of same-sex marriage invites society to reflect on a moral level and condemn restorative therapies as unethical, discriminatory, and abusive. In Greece, the mayor of the remote island of Tilos performed the country's first same-sex marriages on June 3, 2008, wedding 2 men and 2 women, one day prior to the shocking news of Sorianopoulos' assassination. The Justice Ministry reacted immediately by declaring the marriages illegal, as laws referred only to heterosexual couples and all involved in the same-sex marriages would face charges. Justice Minister Sotiris Hatzidakis said in a statement, quote, "There is no legal framework allowing homosexual marriages in Greece. attempts to perform civil ceremonies among gay couples are illegal and such marriages are void, end of quote. The government filed the court process to annul the marriages, stirring demonstrations and protests among the LGBT community. For gay rights activists, the reason for such failure was attributable to institutional homophobia and Greece's powerful Orthodox Church that has also denounced homosexuality as a sin. Isolated attempts to push through legislation the right of homosexuals to get married have brought opposition from a range of established interests, including the Church, and from people who claim to be upholding society's moral principles by keeping the sanctity of marriage as a matter only between people of the opposite sex. In contrast, advocates for marriage equality aim to the separation between church and state, challenging heteronormative rules, and fighting those who use religion to deny same-sex couples their right of marriage. In the United States, same-sex marriage has been legal nationwide since June 26 of the current year, when the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell versus Hodges that state-level bans on same-sex marriage are unconstitutional. What is now considered a victory in America, in other parts of the world, most noticeably in Greece, the country that is considered the cradle of democracy in Western civilization, LGBT couples continue to experience the consequences of unequal benefits and rights. The connection between the homophobic crime of Nikos Arianopoulos and the instant annulment of Greece's first same-sex marriage ceremonies is rooted in the intolerance of difference, uncovering different levels of Greece's social reality. The example of Greece, while looking at the long history of struggle to legalize same-sex marriage in the United States, simply confirm that the denial of civil rights perpetuate phenomena of aggressive homophobia or less aggressive, like conversion therapies, even when hate crime legislation is in place. There is a result through which racism and homophobia affect the relations between people and institutions. Such structures, such as the church, adamantly refuse to provide equality or ability to form families other than the heterosexual model. In fact, society's inability to acknowledge the connection between homophobic hate crimes and the establishment of legal solutions determines the doctrines of hate speech that continues to define homosexuality as a mental disorder, sustaining at the same time therapeutic efforts to transform homosexual orientation into a stabilized heterosexual status. Meanwhile, homophobic abuse and denial of rights took a step further in Greece, with undermining lesbian identity by attacking the word lesbian itself. Three natives from Lesbos, the island that was home to the 6th century BC poet Sappho, lending its name to female homosexuality, took legal action against Greece's largest gay rights organization, Olke, seeking a court decision that would ban anyone except Lesbos natives using the term lesbian. Andrea Gilbert, spokesperson of Athens Pride and a member of Olke, notes the prejudice and hatred behind the lawsuit. The term lesbian, she says, to define women who love women exists in every dictionary of just about all UN member nations. The term is recognized universally, and the homosexual and lesbian community of Greece is a legal entity whose name is legally accepted. This is a ridiculous claim that most Greeks find laughable. However, the underlying homophobia and reactionary sentiment is no laughing matter. Not only is homophobia infused with hatred about same-sex desire, but the enactment of different forms of violence is also shaped by other specificities, such as the assertion of heteronormativity by inserting geographic and topological boundaries into queer notions of identity. Eventually, the Greek court examining the case ruled that homosexual women can be called lesbians, rejecting the islanders' appeal. My conclusion by comparing all these events is that the prevalence of homophobia in both Greece and the US was the impetus behind this presentation. A sociological analysis of an extensive study provides a much larger context from this short version of a paper that was accommodated specifically for this conference. The homophobic incidents described above show that the lack of anti-discrimination law and equality rights legislation, as in the case of Greece, sustain and propagate acts of violence. Understanding the different forms of violence on a global level can tell us much about the dominant perception of homosexuality as a mental disorder, both within and out of the borders of America. Gay rights in Greece resemble the position of gay rights in the United States 30 years ago. However, the rise of the gay rights movement and the shift of scientific theories in the fields of psychiatry and psychology contributed to the reversal of previously held misconceptions. One way to eradicate homophobia is through the strategic use of anti-homophobia education initiatives in schools, colleges, and universities, along with the development of political activism. Through the sharing of stories, the analysis of data, and reification of sexual identity, queer studies, conferences, and public initiatives can lead to positive change. Marriage equality in the United States is very recent, and homophobia still exists within the fabric of the American society. It is therefore necessary to hold conferences and produce research that encourages a wide discussion of queer-phobic practices in the post-marriage era. These pockets of discussion must continue to exist until all forms of homophobic oppression, restorative therapies, and discriminatory practices are addressed and eliminated by queer-positive resistance. Thank you.
Okay. Everyone can see what's on the screen, right? It's not blurry or too big or too small. And everyone can hear me okay? Okay. As Dr. Sloan said, I'm Eric Baldwin, a PhD student at UC Irvine in political science. I'm a quantitative political sociologist focusing on the study of political activism and social movements by using computational and quantitative methodologies. Today's paper, The Bee Isn't Silent, Bisexual Communities and Political Activism, is a chapter in a book entitled The Politics on the Periphery, which will be published by myself, my advisor, and our colleague next summer by Cambridge University Press. This particular chapter that I'm going to share today is also featured in next month's emerging edition of the NYU LGBT Studies Reader. So if you want a full edited version, not my less edited version, you can get it from the LGBT Studies Reader coming from NYU in December. So getting started, political science often gives short shrift to bisexual members of the LGBTQ community. Situated in a binomial distribution of sexuality, straight or not, research has often lumped bisexuals under the larger not straight umbrella. While contestations over social movement priorities and strategies between and among gay men, lesbians, trans persons, and queer persons over social movement priorities and strategies are well known and often studied, the B in LGBTQ is treated as if it is silent. Movement priorities for the bisexual community have often been bracketed by little more than demands for acceptance from the other members of the LGBTQ community. Indeed, a conventional wisdom has developed that bees are not politically active and glide between the full rights panoply of the straight world and the roster of demands for equality from the gay world. Here I present evidence of a politically active and astute bisexual community that is nested not in the traditionally defined LGBTQ movement, but rather in the communities of sexual practice known as polyamory and BDSM. Using survey data and in-depth open-ended questions, I find that self-described bisexuals comprise up to 1/2 of the polyamory community and perhaps as much as 2/3 of the BDSM community. These communities are politically aware and politically active, and the bisexuals within them have specific claims and strategic preferences. In 2015, President Barack Obama became the first president to mention bisexuals in his State of the Union speech, while President Bill Clinton mentioned gays in his 2000 State of the Union speech, no president had ever before acknowledged the existence of bisexuals, lesbians, and as a brief digression, some may argue that Clinton's 2000 speech implicitly included lesbians with his use of the word gays, but he did not explicitly mention lesbians, or transgender people in this important forum. Just like presidents, political scientists have largely ignored the B in LGBT. The B in LGBT is also frequently neglected in the investigation of sexual minorities across the academy and in American political processes. In the Western heterosexual model of sexuality, bisexuals are categorized and incorporated within the larger LGBT community, with their goals and ambitions subsumed within the larger motifs of all sexual minorities. However, this assumption is widely misguided, as bisexuals have a distinct collective identity that face different forms of discrimination and have a discrete set of movement goals and strategies. The reality for bisexuals in the United States is that they are mostly invisible, both within LGBT communities and the larger political system as a whole. Lesbian and gay men, especially the latter, have historically served as the primary faces of the LGBT movement. Recently, many transgendered activists have also emerged as recognizable figures with their own policy priorities, including fighting transphobia within LGBT communities. Bisexual issues, while overlapping in some areas with other sexual minorities, are distinct as they face unique forms of discrimination in the form of monosexism and biphobia from both other LGTs and heterosexuals. In the end, they have been mostly unsuccessful in placing their demands on the agenda of the major national LGBT groups and distinguishing themselves to the broader public. Given this lack of visibility and power within the LGBT community, some bisexuals may have instead found themselves better incorporated into other communities of sexual practice, including polyamory and BDSM. These communities provide them with a venue for potential political action. This paper seeks to demonstrate how the bisexual community has integrated and found a receptive host in polyamory and BDSM communities. With these communities as a base, the bisexual community has engaged in political activism and advocacy to further its own agenda, separate from other sexual minorities. How and where bisexuals and what groups they join are important questions to consider as one grapples with understanding how they form their political attitudes and behaviors. Political scientists have long established group identification in American politics as a source of unified civic engagement and socio-political participation. Uslainer researches, there is substantial research in the canon of political and social inquiry that explains how group identification is relevant in the formation of political values and the degree of collective influence on political systems. Much of the existing literature on group identification addresses ethnicity and social identities, and it finds that individuals usually derive their concept of self from their sense of belonging within social groups. Membership in a group carries emotional significance and causes attitudinal and perceptual values to change. The group and its collective values and biases become affective attachments, and individual members are likely to behave in ways consistent with their group identification. Humans construct dichotomous oppositional binaries that posit us against them, which frequently plays out in partisan American politics. Preference for one platform pairs with negative attitudes towards the opposition. An individual's social identity is intrinsically linked to their behavioral patterns, and for political scientists, this proves to be a largely accurate way to predict voting patterns and political affiliations. George W. Bush's re-election to a second term in the White House for many is the most defining event of the 2004 general election in the United States, but this election carries a different significance to many politically astute LGBTs. On that same day in 2004, 11 states approved state constitutional amendments explicitly banning same-sex marriage, all by ample margins. As Tony Smith, my advisor and mentor, argues in his 2007 paper, this widespread homophobia reveals the electoral capture of gay and lesbian Americans in the current party system. According to Smith, electoral capture may happen when a specific demographic group very closely aligns with one political party but not the other. In these scenarios, typically in a two-party system like our own, one party has no interest in gaining votes from the demographic groups captured by the other. As a result, the party that has captured this group does not have to expend its political capital to produce policy results in favor of that constituency because they are well aware and assume that the individuals in those groups will never vote for the party that openly denigrates them. To make this more relevant, in the case of the United States, the Democratic Party is well aware that LGBT Americans overwhelmingly vote Democratic in every election, and they don't have to openly court their votes because no LGBT American will at least in large part, vote for the Republicans because the Republicans openly denigrate the LGBT community. And the Republicans do that because that curries favor with their base. It allows the Democrats then not to have to campaign for LGBT Americans, allowing them to then attract a more conservative base to gain more votes in elections. Empirical displays of electoral capture are difficult but can be demonstrated by looking at voting patterns of sexual minorities across geography. A group that overwhelmingly supports one party while the other party actively works to impede their course and openly flaunts their disdain indicates the potential for electoral capture. LGBT Americans represent a radically different demographic group that cuts across ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and on a general level possesses very few shared traits and interests and has the large absence of political cohesion. Initiatives and attacks are not responded to in the discourse, and with a lack of competition for votes on behalf of the major parties, electoral capture is likely. Now I'm going to move straight into the flesh of the empirical data and what I've done with my colleagues. And if we examined the bisexual community that is nested within BDSM and polyamory communities. And so BDSM, bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, sadism and masochism, constitutes a global sexual movement involving people of all sexual and gender identities. Levels of participation vary from the mundane, casual experimentation to professional organized BDSM conventions and communities. BDSM involves various subgroups of sexual activity that frequently overlap and sometimes are practiced together. Under the umbrella of BDSM, I include two other branches closely related, often overlapping identities of sexual practice, the leather community and another community known as puppy play. These communities utilize the foundational premise of BDSM, but carry out specific types of scenarios and have taken BDSM in a particular direction. Leather constitutes the use of leather clothing and the fetishization of leather equipment used during dominant and submissive sexual role-playing. The use of black leather carries connotations of masculinity, sexual power differentials, and may impose a degree of discomfort, given the discomfort caused by the tightly bound leather enclosed material and accessories that invoke themes of domination and resistance. A second group that is included in our analysis is puppy play. Puppy play is the execution of submissive and dominant sexual role-playing specifically through the roles of puppy, the submissive partner, and handler, the dominant partner. Puppy play often includes the elements of leather. The puppy participants use leather outfits and plastic props to resemble canines. They act out canine-human scenarios using the mannerisms and behaviors typically seen between humans and domestic canines. Handlers, however, are not always involved. Sometimes puppy play involves just the puppy participants playing with one another, meanwhile establishing dominant submissive relationships with one another. Polyamory represents a long-held socio-sexual practice of engaging in an intimate and sexual relationship with multiple partners simultaneously. They vary in degree of commitment and monogamy, with some being long-term committed relationships, and others being nothing more than non-monogamous sexual partnerships, trysts, if you will. Even more than bisexuals, these groups are largely invisible to the rest of society and are frequently marginalized and labeled as sexual deviants. For the purposes of this research, the groups have been collapsed in two ways. One, the acronym BDSM is used to refer to the traditional group that engages in bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadism, and masochism, in addition to leather and puppy play subsumed under the umbrella of BDSM for the purposes of the analysis of the data. And in the analysis of bisexuality and both BDSM and polyamory communities, I collapsed the terms bisexual under the terms pansexual, switch, bicurious, and heteroflexible. In the data collection, we allowed people to write in their own gender and sexual identity rather than to have to choose from a drop-down menu. This resulted in an extraordinarily colorful and diverse set of terms when you look at the raw data, and we created some word clouds for the book project to see how people write their own gender and sexual identity. But for the purposes of this chapter project, I put underneath the term, I collapsed the terms pansexual, switch, bicurious, and heteroflexible under bisexual. And so when you hear me refer to bisexual, I'm referring to anyone who identified as any one of those things. To examine the connections between bisexual identities, polyamory, and BDSM communities, and political attitudes and behaviors, the research borrowed from a mixture of methods including survey data, interviews, participant observation, and modified ethnography. We administered these surveys at a variety of sites in person, including in the summer of 2014 in polyamory support groups in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then we attended the Beyond Vanilla annual convention of BDSM, and there we initiated sampling. From that point, we engaged in virtual snowball technique sampling, where we asked those people who were respondents in person to distribute our survey instruments via closed online forums, closed Facebook groups, email, and blogs, and they circulated that. Within several weeks, we had over 1,000 responses on every metric, and that was at the time of this writing. It has since gone up. For a number of the demographic characteristics, the sample is not representative of the US population. However, given that polyamory and BDSM are socially constructed identities, it is highly unlikely that they are evenly distributed amongst the US general population. For instance, it is expected that the polyamory community is younger than the population as a whole because evolving social norms are less inhibitory than in the past. It is expected these sexual communities to be younger than the population as a whole because of the role of social media in organizing the community. What this unfortunately means is that there is little way of knowing how closely the sample aligns with the actual demographics of the entire polyamorous identified and BDSM identified population in the United States. Without further data allowing weighing the results based on population demographics, the uneasy assumption is made that the data are representative of those most active in polyamory and BDSM circles. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up very quickly by showing you some data. Oh, it's one of these, okay. So we can see here, this is some of the preliminary results from the data. For the polyamory community, it skews heavily male. If I had a pointer, I would point, but you'll just have to work with me. And then the age, on the age chart, you can see that polyamory skews young, with the vast majority falling between 18 and 49. If we go and we look at BDSM, it skews the opposite way, heavily male and slightly older, with the majority falling between 30 and 64. Some light. Let there be light. No, it's fine. Can everyone still see it? Okay, good. I don't mind working with light. In terms of race, polyamory, we see it's overwhelmingly white. And we see over in terms of education that the vast majority have some college, undergraduate education, and some graduate form of education. However, it's very different on the BDSM level, not in terms of race. Race is the same, overwhelmingly white, but education skews slightly lower, with a much higher percentage of high school or less and far less distribution across the some college to graduate school levels. If we go down and we look at the aggregate results of our total sample, within polyamory, 53% identify as bisexual, BDSM 62%. Out of our total N at the time of this writing, which was 345, it was 57.4% of these communities identified as bisexual. Now, in terms of some of the questions we asked them many, many questions. I just picked 2 or 3 to show you today. In politics today, do you consider yourself? We see in the polyamory category column that it skews, well, for both polyamory and BDSM, it skews from the center and to the left. And when I say the left, I actually mean downwards on this particular chart, but I mean to the left politically. And so we see that polyamory is highly independent, 47% right there, which is curious because BDSM is more evenly distributed between independent and Democrat. If we go to the next question, in general, would you describe yourself, your political views as, and we included a Likert scale. You can see, again, it falls from the center and to the left. BDSM is more evenly distributed in the moderate and liberal categories, whereas polyamory is more distributed in the liberal and very liberal categories, which is an important, statistically significant point. When we ask them about the Supreme Court and their views on that, we can see that polyamory finds the Supreme Court far too conservative, 50% and 17% middle of the road. BDSM, still overwhelmingly 41% conservative, but more distributed in the middle of the road and liberal category. When we asked them how active they were in primary voting as a measure of their political participation, we see polyamory highly active. They're both highly active, both groups. Polyamory more so, whereas BDSM is slightly more distributed between always, near always, and part of the time. So what does this tell us? First, bisexual voices is omitted from the choir of rights emerging from the LGBT movement. Bisexuals, because they have been received coldly in the LGBT movement, have instead found themselves nested in polyamory and BDSM communities, communities of sexual practice, where they have found a more receptive host. The polyamory community is more independent, far more liberal, and less likely to align with traditional party politics, yet both groups are consistently liberal, progressive, and democratic, whereas the BDSM tends to skew older, less educated, more likely to fall in line with party politics and to align themselves with an established party, and to not fall quite as far to the left and more in the general liberal and rather than extreme liberal category. This leads us to believe that this community is politically astute, politically aware, and politically active, meaning that they have group identification and with their political ideas represent a huge, unrealized political influence. Okay, I'll end it there. I know I'm over time.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I do not want a slideshow. How do you play without it advancing?
Without it advancing?
Yeah. So,
Do you mean just
so
starting on
that
this
I can
first slide?
manually advance. Sorry.
It should.
But doesn't that automatically advance after a certain amount of time?
No, not unless
Oh,
you set it to
okay.
do so. Yeah.
All right, great.
So you should do, that should be okay.
Great. Thank you. Is that visible despite the lights? Hi, I'm Lilith, and
Keep going.
all right, that's good. My investment in the corrective rape epidemic comes initially from a tension in feminist epistemology and ethics. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. Ethics involves questions of how we value actions, decisions, beliefs. Feminist epistemology and ethics is caught in a tension between needing universality and objectivity. Very briefly, universality means it applies to all people in all situations at all times. Objectivity is the idea that there can be an entirely unbiased perspective. In Enlightenment epistemology, this is often portrayed through what Nagel calls the God's eye view. We can imagine a God who exercises no biases, has no position. That view is objective. Feminist epistemology and ethics needs universality for ideas such as gender as a construct, all humans are due basic human rights, or rape is wrong. You need to be able to say this is applicable in all situations at all times in order to protect basic human rights, for example, or protect against rape. And yet, feminist epistemology and ethics rejects universality for ideas such as individuals' perspectives are situated, or privilege skews judgment, distinctive cultures have divergent values. Essentially, they want to be able to say our ideals as Western knowledge producers are applicable universally, and yet we stand in a problematic position because we have certain privileges that essentially bias our behaviors and views. One proposed solution is standpoint epistemology. The major proponent of this is Sandra Harding, who writes, "The notion of value-free objectivity is morally and politically regressive." She has a problem with this objectivity. She recognizes the biases that it allows to be perpetuated. She recognizes how having certain knowledge producers excludes knowledge produced by others, and so she proposes standpoint epistemology, which disputes these traditional formulations and questions whether one can be objective. So in recognizing that objectivity is not attainable, she proposes a strong objectivity. So unlike the weak objectivity that veils the biases, perpetuates the epistemological power structures, she wants us to be reflexive, self-reflective, and to think about our positionality, to think about the positionality of those who are concerned in the issues we're addressing, and consider the standpoint. It preserves objectivity as an ideal while recognizing that it's unattainable. In order to attain a standpoint epistemology, she has a democratic view. So, including views from important sectors of the population, she aims to produce a democratically representative model. This sounds good, right? We want democracy. We want democratically reflective views. We want the population's interests to be represented in the ethical decisions we make, right? What about when the representatives of democracy are not upholding human rights? This is a fatal flaw in standpoint epistemology. To consider that, I look at the practice of corrective, and the corrective is in quotation marks because that is the aim of the practice, but it's obviously a highly problematic aim. The idea is that men, rape lesbians in an effort to reform them, to turn them straight. That's the justification. It's from there that the name comes. Corrective rape tortures and silences South African lesbians. This is where the practice is most predominant, so where I'm focusing. It reinforces their vulnerability, and that only compounds the support, the popular support for corrective rape. In this paper, I've used the word corrective rape victim to emphasize that the outcome is often death. There are many survivors, but that is not necessarily the aim, and unfortunately, not the usual outcome. The dominant democratic morality of South African society affirms lesbianism's immorality and the potential to cure it through rape. So the democratic view in South Africa supports the practice. One second. As represented, Jacob Zuma, the former president of South Africa, was found guilty of corrective rape, but he was acquitted. And one of the reasons, the court found that she was in the wrong for being a lesbian, and he was in the right for trying to reform her. Here are two quotations, and I'd like to give you a moment to read these in silence. These are from a 2011 Human Rights Watch report from people who experienced corrective rape. The sources of the anti-lesbianism, and I group this as lesbianism not because that is inclusive of all the identities of the people who suffer from corrective rape, but because this is part of the motivation and how it's seen in the South African discourse. So the first two factors are from that same Human Rights Watch report. There's overwhelming pressure to maintain normative gender and sexuality roles, and we can see this also as a impact of the trauma of apartheid. Conservative South African Christianity, as which 80% of the population identifies, in Human Rights Watch's words, significantly contributes to a climate of intolerance, which in turn fuels a climate of discrimination and violence. Preachers preaching against homosexuality compound the problem. The inculcation of very conservative Christian views in the schools compounds the problem. And anyone who looks at Christianity in South Africa will recognize significant differences from Christianity in Europe and North America, and that was a tool of the imperialists to try to control the local populations. They changed the Bible that they gave South Africans. Social and institutional complicity, the police, the politicians, they are part of the corrective rape movement. And here we have the Zuma example. And women in apartheid South Africa were denied humanity, were reduced to their sex, in Louise du Toit's words. The justifications for corrective rape make victims into women, lesbian women, as a very set category that mirrors that trauma. So we can see, again, the damage apartheid did as a source of the corrective rape epidemic. My first critique of standpoint epistemology through this example is that of intersectionality. So if we want to have a democratically representative model in which to evaluate the ethical consideration, that's complicated by the fact that no one is a single issue, single identity individual. So the people who are experiencing corrective rape are not always identifying as lesbians. And it's not only their sexuality that is constitutive of their position, it's also their race. Very few white South Africans experience corrective rape. There are class issues, race issues. Of course, the traumas of imperialism should also be considered, and that compounds the intersectionality. The objectives are not only about sexuality, there are also political objectives. There are also, as in the first example, or the first rationale for this epidemic, there are also examples of wanting to perpetuate certain norms that they see as essentially South African. Also the ethical particularity. So whose morality matters in issues of minority rights? Does the democratic consensus matter if the people at stake are not democratically a majority or even a plurality? And this has relevance for all situations of ethical discourse and democracy, and is a significant critique also in how we evaluate human rights through law in democracies. And then whose morality matters concerning crimes against specific identities? Should people who are not subject to these crimes have any say in the morality? As we see in the South African context, non-lesbians overwhelmingly support the practice. Should their morality matter? And then democracy. You've seen this as a theme throughout the argument. If the population subject to a violence is not the democratic majority, is that violence democratically condonable? How do we evaluate that? So democratically determined ethics insufficiently protects minorities and social political others. Harding, Sandra Harding, the primary proponent of standpoint epistemology, asks us to become outsiders within, to incorporate standpoint theory into knowledge production. So as academics, we hold this privileged position, and yet we can consider the standpoints of others in the population as part of that knowledge production. What about those who are unable or unwilling to move within, the outsiders without? Or in the example of Jacob Zuma, he is probably loath to consider the perspective of the South African lesbians. Louise Dutoit, previously mentioned, writes that doing epistemic justice, so when we are considering what rape is, doing justice to the knowledge around the practice, requires that its damage be adequately explained and acknowledged. Not only the damage to the individual, not only the specific rape, but also the society or the group. Also, South African non-gender conforming, non-sexuality conforming populations. Also South Africa as a whole, which is perpetuating the traumas of apartheid South Africa. The art on the previous slide was from Zanelle Muholi, and I highly recommend, I want to point out her name here. I highly recommend her as an artist, activist, who is approaching the corrective rape epidemic from the perspective, perhaps a standpoint perspective, of the individuals who have been involved. I'm happy to share a bibliography upon request. And thank you.
Thank you all for those insightful presentations. I think the ways in which your work is talking to one another is really interesting. So some things that I picked out sort of in common is that these papers are all very much interested in sort of minority group identity or group cohesion. and or how to protect those groups, right? So Eric is thinking about how a group becomes visible, and I wonder if bisexuals even are becoming visible, or if they're becoming visible as practitioners of polyamory or BDSM, right? So are they becoming visible as bisexuals as such, right? And then Stefanos is thinking about sort of how discourse can shape, can either perpetuate sort of homophobic practices, or how transnational discourse can inspire sort of majority support, thinking particularly about how the case of Matthew Shepard circulates maybe in Greece. And then Lilith is thinking about how do we protect minority groups in a democracy? Is democracy sufficient to support these minority groups? Excuse me. I had a question I have questions for all of you, but my question for Stefanos is I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this case with the actor, because you mentioned that it was a hate crime, but from the way that it was sort of narrated in your paper, that surprised me afterwards. So I wonder if you could give us a little more context there.
Yes, well, yeah, I didn't include many information about the crime itself. It was done by a 31-year-old immigrant from Georgia who entered Greece illegally, and he was making a living by hustling in downtown Athens. And when he was arrested, something like three weeks later, because nobody knew who committed the crime, he claimed that the victim insulted his manhood by, so I didn't include this information just because I need
Sure, the
to,
limits of time, but now we have some time to talk about it.
Exactly. So basically the victim made a point, and with his lawyers in court, that he was, he followed the actor to his apartment, they used drugs, but he didn't want to be involved into a receptive passive role in the sexual encounter, and that insulted his manhood, so he killed him. So it was a hate crime from the perspective that a particular sexual practice, like being passive in sex between two men, is something that is still not considered, insulting for some men, and for that reason, it is regarded as a hate crime.
And it was tried as a hate crime?
It was tried as a hate crime, correct.
Okay.
The killer himself did not admit that he's a homosexual. He was saying that he was a heterosexual man. So that was the interesting point in the whole story. And of course, the actor's case in Greece operates in the same way as Matthew Shepard here in America, because it created a public discourse about homosexuality and how homosexuals are being abused, or even come to a point of murder in many cases because of intolerance.
Okay, that's very interesting. I have another question for Eric, and I was wondering that even if bisexuals as such become a sort of a political group, are they going to be courted, especially if they are sort of attached to these larger BDSM and polyamorous communities? I'm thinking about the feminist sex wars, and how sort of there was this alliance between anti-pornography feminism and the extreme right that was invested in demonizing particularly SM in a large way, and it wasn't as if the Democrats sort of leapt to anyone's defense. So I wonder if, because they are attached to these sort of what to the mainstream might look like extreme sexual practices, will they be courted as a political group?
you want me to answer your question from earlier too?
Sure,
Oh,
sure,
okay,
whatever you like.
So about because the first question you asked too is also very interesting and very relevant, which you asked about how they identify, and if they, now that they're nested in these other communities, do they identify first as a member of what, BDSM or polyamory or one of the subgroups, or do they identify as bisexual? What is their first identification? And we asked them, and it was an open-ended question, and we asked them to list what their identities were. And we didn't prompt them too much because we wanted to see what they would say. And frequently, they would identify as a member of the group before they identified as a member, as a bisexual or as a member of the LGBT community. That was always like fourth. They were first a member of BDSM, and very much so the members of the polyamory community, because it's a much more socially integrated community. That was always their first identity, then bisexual, then something else, et cetera, woman, man. The people have various ways of ordering their identity. So that's actually really fascinating to think about, because it does have ramifications for how they might organize in the future politically, their political cohesion, if they're going to organize on which feeds into your next question, which is, if they were to become a political unit, a politically active group with group consciousness, what would they identify and be formed on the basis of their bisexuality or on the basis of their presence in these communities? Well, given that in large part their identity, their first priority identity is their membership in one of these groups, we hypothesized that they would organize on the basis of these communities of sexual practice, which would then have deeper ramifications for political processes. Because it's one thing, and it's already, things are softening politically in terms of major, especially on the Democratic side in the United States, that are courting and favoring and speaking more openly about sexuality. Whereas even 10 years ago, Hillary Clinton wouldn't talk about the topic at all. She went out onto the floor of the Senate and actually said, was supported DOMA, et cetera. Now she totally backpedals on that. But these other communities, these communities that are labeled as sexually deviant by the mainstream society, will pose an entirely and much deeper conflict for political parties, because these are people on both sides, the right and the left, in large part, find to be deviant and abnormal. And so that's going to be a much longer and much more difficult struggle to kind of get any political salience. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, look, I don't know that I have a hard question for you, but I so appreciated your paper and thought it was addressing something very important. But I'd like to open up to questions from you all out there. Please, if anyone has any questions. Sean, go ahead.
For Lilith, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the contiguities you see between apartheid and the present, and what, if there are any changes between that moment and legacy.
I think that's a really important question, and I'm trained as a philosopher, not as an a very important question. I'm trained as a philosopher, not an historian, so I feel under-equipped to address particularities of continuity from apartheid to now. Other people who have done work on that are, for example, Louise Dutoit, and I would point to their observations about the position of women under apartheid and then position of women under white-ruled apartheid South Africa and the position of homosexuals under the current regime, and point out that there is an important differentiation between what the stated rights are, or the stated protections, and what the actual rights and protections are. And of course, in apartheid South Africa, there was this facade of protecting, especially women. And now the laws of South Africa have a facade of protecting the LGBTQ community, for example, marriage equality, and that has done little to protect individuals from actual violence.
One thing I'd like to say really quick, when you guys ask questions, if you guys could repeat them into the mics, because the audio is only being recorded through there.
Gotcha.
So just for future listening, and they won't miss questions.
Okay.
Because we can hear them as an audience, but the camera doesn't pick it up unless it's spoken into the microphone.
Okay, great. Okay. I guess I also have questions about, questions that pertain to your paper, Lilith, but questions that maybe more highlight my own knowledge gaps about LGBT lives in South Africa. So I wonder if this is happening, if corrective rapes specifically target lesbians, are gay men allies in sort of trying to, are gay men aligning themselves with lesbians to try and fight this issue or make some headway here? Or are the communities very separate? And how is how gay male homosexuality received differently? But again, I think that highlights my own knowledge gaps rather than what your paper is speaking to.
Very briefly, I would say that. Should I
Just bring it
closer?
closer to you.
Very briefly, I would say that there are multiple approaches to this issue. So, for example, artworks. There are scholars talking about it, the Human Rights Watch. There are governmental organizations making a gesture. And I'm sure that there are gay men involved in all parts of the activism. If you look at the very visible activism, it's primarily I wouldn't call them lesbians, let's say women loving women, female bodied, female identified, and primarily Black South Africans who are involved.
Okay. Yes.
I have a question for Lilith as well. So I really like the way that you used you deconstructed the standpoint epistemology through this lived experience, and then came up with some questions. So I have questions about your questions. So at the end of, after looking at the issues that remain from standpoint epistemology, we have the question of ethics. The ethics of does the majority get to speak to an issue that affects a minority? And so I guess it brings back the question that you had at the very beginning. From where do we have our ethics? Where do we reach to understand what is ethical and what isn't, if we are realizing now that it can't be completely contextual to like a majority, a numerical majority. And yet we also want to embrace this idea of context and perhaps multiplicity of truths. So where do we situate it? If we don't situate it from a God's eye view, and we don't situate it from a purely democratic or majority view?
I'm going to dutifully repeat this question.
Oh.
So if a more succinct version of this question is, what then becomes the basis for ethics if we are eschewing objectivity? If democratic representation is no longer acceptable, then where do we get our ethics from?
Thank you. The next part of my paper is suggesting a justice-based model, which has its own slew of Western epistemological problems, because justice, defined in philosophy, is primarily defined by Western philosophers. An advantage of a justice-based model is that it can incorporate some of these standpoints, can be place-specific in terms of which knowledge heredity it draws upon. Another alternative that I've also worked on is using Hannah Arendt's natality. And this is the idea that each person through their birth is imbued with a set of human rights. And that focuses on individual rights, which, as you're probably aware, has its own problems of, is the individual more important or the individual society? It's very difficult, especially in the academy, to get away from European, North American knowledge practices. I don't have an absolute answer of this is where we can find a perfect ethical model. I think that following justice, following natality can offer some valuable ways forward that can move beyond a justice-based model to better protect minorities. Well, I have a question, if I may,
Please do.
for Stefanos.
Yes.
And that is, you used the word, you were talking about the hate crime, and you used the word assassination.
Yes.
And I'm curious about the categories of where they overlap, especially when you were speaking of some of the background of the murder. Is it a political category because he is a celebrity? Is it an assassination because there are also politics of borders at play with the murderer coming from another country? Why did you choose that word? Do you see it as an assassination in this case, or are you making a broader argument about hate crimes?
To be honest, it was part of a larger argument about hate crimes and how a recognizable figure like the actor instigated a larger discussion about homosexuality and how a hate crime can actually function as a model for bringing into a larger public debate the human rights issues and homosexual rights. I used the word assassination not in a political context, although many in Greece tend to see the political aspect of it because the person who committed the crime had a total different idea of homosexuality. He was a foreign immigrant, he was an illegal immigrant, and he tried to defend himself by presenting himself as the victim of unfortunate circumstances that that made him to kill the actor, and he wouldn't admit that he is a killer. So from that point of view, maybe you can say that it is not an assassination. It was more like a crime that was made in the heat of the moment. But at the same time, what was more important for me is to bring into this as something, as an example that operated similarly to the Matthew Shepard case in the United States, because Matthew Shepard is unknown in Greece. So by using this example and by using the model of the martyr, making case, I'm presenting an argument that we need those martyrs in order to create a larger public discourse. And when I compare it with other types of hate crime, which does not, of course, reach the severity of a killing, like restorative therapies, we don't have such martyrs. So in that case, I see less of a public discussion because we don't have something to refer to as strongly as a person who died, like the actor or Matthew Shepard in the US. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but the use of the word assassination can actually be argued that it may have a political meaning or not, considering from which point of view you're looking at it.
Well, and that's interesting to me because this process of constructing a martyr, right, is sort of exactly what is not happening in South Africa around corrective rape, right? In the sense that that because the majority accepts corrective rape as a tolerable, if not a practice to be promoted, that's just an interesting tension to me. I don't know if I have much to say beyond that. But
I believe that by relating to someone who was recognizable widely as the actor, or Matthew Shepard who became a recognizable figure after the crime, tend to create a larger public discussion. And in terms of, with respect to the corrective rape practice in South Africa, if the model of the martyr is missing, that is unfortunate and problematic at the same time, I believe that perhaps we're not doing enough. We need a point of reference in order to shake people. And I'm not, of course, supporting the martyrdom in any case. I mean, but at the same time, I admit that martyrs can actually generate a public discourse which can bring change eventually.
And there's also the element of democratic approval because he was a celebrity,
Yes.
because he wasn't only a homosexual but identifiable on other levels.
Yes, yeah, I mean, he was in the closet. He never admitted his homosexuality. He was dating women occasionally. He was being idolized by the women population, more or less like the Tom Cruise kind of type in Greece. But there were some rumors about his homosexuality, so when that happened, the whole myth of his masculinity was debunked, and then everything came into the fore, like about his hidden life, and there were people who were hurt from his immediate family environment, so it was a very tragic story. And what I'm trying to say by correlating all these three different cases is that the culture of homophobia cannot change necessarily through legislation. Legislation, of course, when it comes to same-sex marriage is very important, but it doesn't stop there. So the culture of homophobia has to change with education, conferences like this one, with other forms of public debate, and it has to be constant.
Okay, unless there are any more questions. Yep, okay.
I'd like to ask Eric about this situation. It sounds like the LGBT community is sort of discriminating against bisexuals, or in some way rejecting them, whatever. And is that true?
So this question is about the status of bisexuals in the larger LGBT community. Are they accepted or are they stigmatized?
So you say discrimination. In my research and the reading of the existing literature, I would not describe, my assessment would be that they are not actively discriminated against, but there is a certain degree of biphobia and monosexism, which just means that the other components of the LGBT, et cetera, other letters, community feel that the bisexuals need to really, to put it frankly, pick a side. They can't be doing this, and that they're neither in one camp or the other. And that has caused them to be received in a cold way in the community, which has then caused them to seek out political hosts elsewhere because they have found themselves alienated from the rest of the LGBT community. In terms of active discrimination and pushing them out, I haven't seen evidence of that. Does that answer your question?
So they're sort of rejected.
Yes. And because the very nature of being a bisexual, if they're engaged in a relationship at some point in time, it's either with a man or a woman. And so if a man is in a relationship with another man, at that point in time, they're not really bisexual. They're engaging in an entirely homosexual relationship. Or if a man is in a relationship with a woman, then it's an entirely heterosexual relationship at that point in time, the nature of that relationship. And so it causes these other distinctions. The LGBT movement elites would say something along the line. They would essentially suggest that person is temporarily out of the movement, and they have not been receptive to that type of fluidity.
And it's a problem of visibility, right? Which is
Yeah.
exactly part of the crux of what you're getting at.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's intolerance.
I think that's intolerance is particularly vague. It could mean any number of things, but yes, perhaps I think it's a desire to move towards binary thinking. rational decision theory would indicate to us that humans want to think about things in binary ways. We like things to be black and white. We don't like gray, messy things on a very subconscious level. And so the fact that bisexuals are neither one thing nor the other, they move between the not straight and the straight world, I think affects the rest of the LGBT movement on a psychic level, and then causes so I guess it can cause a degree of intolerance, yes.
Okay, well then, but what I'm trying to ask is there, do you see similarity between this quote intolerance within the LGBT community and the intolerance of the LGBT community by the outside community? Is there some similar pattern there? The community is complaining about their role in the dominant culture, and they're doing the same thing. Is there any validity to that, in your opinion?
Yes, there's quite a bit of validity of that for that argument in the social movement research literature, which there's a huge volume of literature that's specifically dedicated to this issue, which is not so much the issues that social movements and political movements face from external sources, but the issues that arise in tensions and that occur within a single movement and between movements on a coalition level is sometimes takes up more time and energy that prevents movements from actually getting anything done, because they're just fighting internally and there's factions. So yes, there is validity to what you said.
I hate to put a stop to this dialogue, but we're at the end of our time for the panel. So I encourage you, if you have further questions for our panelists, to seek them out today. And you have about 13 minutes now until our next session. Thank you all for your attendance.
Thank you for your moderation.
Thank you.